field, things started very rough. I mentioned we planted on May the 17th. May the 27th, we did start to have some emergence, definitely not where we had our final stand. It was definitely very sparse. By June the 4th, though, we did have our first true leaf, so the cotton was finally starting developing, and it looked like we were going to make it. But by June the 19th, it was 4-leaf cotton, but the growth had really slowed down. We had a lot of disease. It looked horrible. And I really anticipated that Stan was going to come in and say, we're terminating, this is bad. There was a lot of pythium that I found out there, so root rot. I just thought this is not going to be good. But he kept it, so it was great. So as I mentioned, we had the 2 treatments, irrigating at Pinhead Square and then the full bloom. So this is a picture that was taken on July the 31st, and the field was blocked by irrigation. So this left is the Pinhead Square, and this right is the full bloom. And you can see by this point, there was about 3 inches of water that had been put on this Pinhead Square treatment at this point. And just in the canopy, the height of the growth, you can really see an observable difference in the plant structure. And of course, well, okay, you're probably going to make more yield over here. But nevertheless, it's really interesting as we move forward to see how that differed. These are actually some images from Cirrus Imagery. David Reinert and Eric, they have this service and they provide this. And it was interesting to watch over the season just how the field conditions progressed with this. So this was on June the 30th before any irrigation was initiated. So the Pinhead Square irrigation was actually in early July. So this yellow, orange, this indicates a very hot, warm field. So you can see that out there. But over here, by July the 29th, we can see that where we had started irrigating, field conditions had started to cool down. The right side, where we had not started irrigating, still very hot. And then, of course, we progressed throughout the season. So it was really interesting to have this throughout the season to be able to track that. Another thing that's actually pretty handy for is also observing leaks in drip systems. So there was actually a 6,500th inch irrigation that had been applied in June. So I should be clear on that and be very transparent about that. Even though we had not initiated irrigation, there was 6,500ths of an inch that had been put on across the whole field, just because it did start to look a little stressed with that. So moving into yield, it was actually very interesting to see the difference between the maturity classes. And it was a bigger difference than I even anticipated. So over on the left, these are the 3 early maturing varieties, the Delta Pine 1820, Delta Pine 1908, and Next Gen 2982. The blue bar is irrigation initiated at Pinhead Square, and the gray bar is irrigation initiated at peak bloom. And so what we saw is, a big difference between the irrigation treatments for the early maturing. Now for the early medium maturing varieties, actually there wasn't that big of a difference between irrigation. And even though this right here numerically shows that these are pretty comparable, this bar right here actually represents the variability across the field. So this is showing the high to the low. So again, there's a lot of variability across this, and Delta Pine 1908 really resulted in a lot of variability just due to that later irrigation. So looking at just these early varieties for year 1, as I mentioned earlier, those early varieties are determinate. So that means that they're going to shut down. It's not going to be this tree that's just going to keep on going indefinitely like those longer maturing varieties tend to do. And withholding irrigation until peak bloom did cause these early varieties to shed their upper and exterior position bolls and blooms. So we were really holding those bolls in those first fruiting positions with that. And then, of course, once those early varieties were done, they were done. So with this peak bloom, even though we came in and started irrigating later in the season, that plant didn't kick back into gear and try and compensate. It was done, it was shut down, it wasn't going to produce anything else. And so that was something that was really interesting, looking at the difference between an early maturing variety and an early medium maturing variety an early maturing variety with regards to irrigation timing. If you're actually coming in and you have limited water, this early maturing variety, it's going to shut down. And so I think that that's kind of contrary to how we traditionally manage our early maturing varieties. Often we're putting the early maturing varieties on dry land or very limited water, thinking, okay, it is gonna shut down, but it's gonna be able to handle that water stress. Well, what it does though is shut down and it doesn't even have the chance to compensate for that stress. Whereas when we actually look at those early medium maturing varieties, even though as a whole they yielded lower than the early maturing varieties, those early medium maturing varieties had significantly less of a yield gap by initiating irrigation at peak bloom. They were able to stay actively growing, they're more indeterminate, they were able to compensate for missing that early season irrigation. So with this, the early, as I mentioned here, more indeterminate, they can compensate by going ahead and putting on some of those outer position bowls. And so there's definitely less of a yield gap with that. So if we actually go in and look at the yield data with these, so for the pinhead square treatment, our total seasonal irrigation was 8 inches. And the average lint yield across all 6 varieties for those, counting for both the early and the early medium, was right at 1,300 pounds of lint. So just looking at irrigation and not taking into account the differences between maturity class, we see that the pinhead square treatment made 165 pounds of lint for every inch of irrigation water that was applied. So this is just irrigation use efficiency, not the total water use efficiency. Now the peak bloom irrigation, we only applied 4.7 inches of irrigation to that treatment during the whole season. So that's pretty significant with regards to just the difference between the 2 irrigation treatments. For the peak bloom, the average was right at 1,158 pounds of lint across all those varieties. The irrigation use efficiency, though, was 246 pounds of lint per inch of irrigation water applied. So that's pretty significant when you look at just the difference. Yes, the pinhead square yielded more, but when we actually look at the water, the peak bloom made more lint per unit of water applied. So, of course, this is on drip, as Nick pointed out, and so we do know that with drip we will have greater irrigation use efficiency just because we have less evaporation from the surface, but nevertheless, if you're looking at drip compared to a very well-maintained center pivot, you're pretty comparable with regards to your efficiency there. So across all varieties, we did make 158 more pounds of water with 158 pounds more lint with 3.3 inches of water. So if we actually put $1 to that, and just assuming an average loan value, 52-cent base loan per pound, we made $82 more per acre with our pinhead square treatment because we made, of course, more lint. But what is the irrigation cost? So at $7.50 per acre inch, just kind of a rough number. Of course, if you have more lift or greater pipeline length or whatever it is, it's going to differ. But just assuming $7.50, initiating an irrigation at pinhead square cost $25 more per acre, but increased the profit by still increased profit by about $57 per acre. So that's still significant. We look at $57 per acre, that's seeding costs or herbicides or fertilizer. That's a pretty significant impact. But again, we have to take into account, is there an opportunity cost? So if you are sharing water with a corn crop and you start irrigating at pinhead square, what have you done to your corn yield? Have you, early on, have you limited your ear size? If you had irrigation on your corn crop at tasseling, moved it over to your cotton crop at tasseling, did you affect pollination and kernel set? So that's pretty significant. So even though we did make more lint and a greater profit by initiating irrigation at pinhead square, what was the opportunity cost and what was the potential lost yield for that corn crop? Of course, quality is a big consideration too. When we actually come in and look at the mic between all these varieties, between the 2 irrigation strategies, we saw that everything fell within that premium grade range from 3.8 to 4.6. We do see lower mite though by initiating irrigation at pinhead square versus initiating irrigation at peak bloom. And of course that's just because we have a greater yield with that pinhead square treatment. So we have a dispersion of those resources. Whereas with the peak bloom treatment, we have fewer number of bowls. So those carbohydrates are going to be concentrated in fewer number of bowls and actually result in higher mite. Now, of course, we can have mite that's too high, and that, is always a possibility depending on how you're managing your water or any resource resulting in a mite that's too high. That can also negatively impact your loan value. So with this project in summary, for the early varieties, our greatest response to irrigation was in those first position bowls. More medium maturing varieties were able to recover with later irrigation. And of course, this is still tricky in our corn cotton rotation. And as we look at this, how far north does this type of strategy apply? In extension, we're actually getting lots of questions even out of Kansas. And while we have questions and we often look to the Southern High Plains for management strategies, Kansas producers are actually looking to this northern panhandle region and curious how y'all are managing your varieties, how y'all are managing irrigation, and so would these strategies actually apply even farther north? So it definitely becomes very tricky. But I do think that this first year data is actually very applicable to as you're looking at variety placement on your limited water field. I think that even though some of these very early varieties have a very good yield potential, we saw that with the NextGen 2982. In many locations, we've seen FiberMax 1320 actually yield exceptionally well. That's another very early variety. But if we're placing those varieties on limited water, there's the potential they're going to shut down. And so if you're managing water with the corn crop or hoping to compensate with some later season precipitation, those varieties aren't going to kick back in gear and compensate. So on limited water, we might actually be better going with an early medium maturing variety that gives us the opportunity to compensate, manage that water a little better, as well as maximize the yield for our corn crop. Of course, again, side by side, the early maturing varieties did make about 158 more pounds, but again, depending on how you're managing your water, your greatest economic benefit might actually be with an early medium maturing variety. So with that, does anyone have any questions?
Hey Jordan, tell us what you're doing in that picture.
Okay, I didn't show this data only because I felt like I had so much information and it was information overload. So another thing we actually started doing this past year was actually tagging blooms. And one of the questions that I received, I know Nick's received it from producers, is what is the last effective bloom date for cotton in this northern panhandle region? And so here at the Water District, as well as at the trial in Dowling County, Mike Drag and I tagged blooms. And we started in early August, and we tagged every other day until we hit August the 20th. And I think that many people believe August the 20th is going to be our last effective bloom date, but again, a lot of that data comes out of the Southern High Plains. And I admittedly, until this past year, have also thought, August 15th, August 20th, those cotton plants are still blooming during that period. But what we saw is that by the time we hit August the 7th to August the 10th, we had plants they were shedding blooms in bowls like crazy. And it's just that plant's natural mechanism to maintain bowls that are actually going to make yield, and it's going to get rid of everything else that it doesn't need. Now, of course, one of the questions is, was that a function of just those very hot temperatures we saw early August this year? So it'll be interesting to see what happens this next year. But we really did see that by August the 7th to August the 10th, right in that window, that this year was our last effective bloom date. So really what that means is, we get into later parts of the season and we start shedding blooms, and I have producers all the time calling, well, should I maybe splash a little extra fertilizer on, or maybe a little extra irrigation, or do something to stop it from shedding? Well, at that point, that plant might already be done, and it knows what it's going to maintain and make a yield with, and throwing extra resources to that plant is actually just money that could be thrown away. So we're going to be continuing tagging that and doing that work with the Water District and those cotton and conservation videos this next year. This plant was actually out here on the farm here, and this was the it's like my four-leaf clover. There was actually 7 fruiting positions on this branch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I've never seen anything like that. And of course, it wound up shedding everything and only keeping 1 and 2. But nevertheless, it was pretty amazing to see 7. Did you say you've seen?
I've got one in my office that's 8.
Oh wow, yeah. So you have a 5-leaf clover. I just found a 4-leaf. But yeah, so thank you to North Plains Groundwater Conservation District for their support for this, and I do hope that moving forward, this is something the district wants to continue, and I think it's very valuable and applicable to y'all as we manage both our corn and our cotton in this region.